Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think I'll try that again. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
That's better. That's a better Texan welcome, I think. It's a great pleasure to be with you in this beautiful university. What a delightful setting we have for this evening's conversation. And we are to address the question, has science buried God? It's science and the God question. And I would encourage you, if you've got a question, as was mentioned earlier, to write it down during the time I'm speaking, because that's the time when you think of the question. And then we'll have a look at as many of the questions as we can afterwards. Of course, asking a question like that, has science buried God? In one sense, the answer is obviously not. How could it be? It's like saying, has automobile engineering buried Henry Ford? You know, it's as simple as that in one sense, and we could go home. But I think you need a little bit more explanation than that. One of the big problems in this topic is actually the nature of explanation and the vast confusion there is in the contemporary world. What is an explanation? Is God an explanation who competes for science and so on? And we'll begin to unpack that. But on the face of it, it puzzles me a bit that there's such an ingrained impression in the West these days that science and belief in God are incompatible. Because you just have to look at the Nobel Prizes. In the 100 years between 1901 and 2000, over 65% of Nobel Prize winners have believed in God. Now, I want to add to that the fact that if you look at the Nobel Prize for Physics, for instance, Steven Weinberg from the University of Austin won it some years ago. He's an atheist. William Phillips, also of the United States, won it a bit more recently. And he's a Christian. And the very fact that you've got two people of such eminence in science who've won the Nobel Prize shows you they're not divided by their science. They're equally brilliant. What divides them is their worldview. So the idea that science is against God is just false, obviously, straight away. But the deeper issue is to pinpoint where the conflict really lies. And the conflict lies not between science and God, but between worldviews. The worldview of atheism and the worldview of theism, Christian theism in my case. Those are the worldviews that are in conflict. They're diametrically opposed to one another. And the real question that faces us tonight is this: where does science sit? Does science point, as Weinberg would claim, against God? Does it point nowhere? Or does it point, as I would claim, towards the existence of God? That's the real question, it seems to me. And it's interesting, people who've studied the so-called conflict myth, as it's now called, that science and religion are opposed, now ask the question, how is it possible that such a myth got going in the first place? Now, I shall be talking about evidence. I'm a pure mathematician, so I'm not going to be using the word proof, because in English, the word proof has at least two meanings, and they get very confused in people's minds. There's proof in the mathematical sense, where you start with axioms, you proceed on the basis of certain logic, and you come to your conclusion. The only field of human thought where you get that is in mathematics, and I'm not here to talk mathematics tonight. You may be very glad to hear. But in the informal sense, proof, as the lawyers would use it, beyond reasonable doubt, means evidence, pointers, and so on. Let me illustrate what I mean by that. I've been married for 47 years to the same girl. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd stake my life on it. What I'm saying is, although you don't have the kind of proof you'd associate with mathematics, you still have very, very strong reason. I couldn't prove to you logically that the Boeing that flew me to Dallas 2 or 3 nights ago from London would get me here, but I staked my life on it. So let's get this clear. We're talking about pointers, evidence, and in the very nature of things, that evidence is cumulative. It builds up. It comes from different areas. And I won't be able to touch in every area because this is a huge topic. But I hope that in your questions you will tease out some of the little extras. Now, what kind of evidence would you look for? Well, history is a very good place to start with. Most intellectual disciplines have a history, and often that's the best way to introduce them. And certainly it is when it comes to the relationship between science and theology. Now, modern science, to which we owe our iPhones and everything else, what a self-centered world we've got in technology, it arose in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the great figures like Galileo and Kepler and Newton and so on, they all believed in God. Now, that's such a striking fact that historians and philosophers of science have given a lot of thought to it. Is there a connection? And the answer is, by and large, there's a very strong connection. C.S. Lewis, when he was summarizing the writings of Alfred North Whitehead, the great North American historian and philosopher of science, put it this way: men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, here's a fascinating thing. For those pioneers of modern science to which we owe so much, their faith in God was not a hindrance to their science, it was the motor that drove it. Now, that's the first baseline fact. It's often called Whitehead's thesis or Merton's thesis or anybody else's thesis. Now, to be fair, when I debated this with Richard Dawkins, he said, but just a moment, everybody believed in God in those days, so it's not surprising that science arose in a God-fearing kind of environment. Well, Richard Dawkins didn't realize that the world is bigger than Western Europe. Everybody didn't believe in God in those days. And the Chinese, who are the most interesting, they discovered a lot of technology, brilliant technology, but they never discovered abstract science. And a lot of effort had gone into thinking, why did this not develop in the Far East? And it was a man called Joseph Needham, who was a brilliant intellectual at Cambridge. He was a chemist, but he was a sinologist. He spoke brilliant Chinese. He's the author of the definitive history of technology in China and so on. And he was a neo-Marxist. And for years, he wrestled with this. Why did we not have this breakthrough like we got through Galileo and Kepler? In the end, he had to give up the Marxist explanation. And the conclusion he came to was this. He said, I can only find it in the fact that the Chinese didn't have a unifying concept of a single creator who created the universe to run and fix laws. So there is evidence from the other side. So that's point number one. Historically, we've got a precedent for linking faith in God as the intelligence behind the universe and the doing of science. And sometimes I put it quite provocatively, and I said, you know, I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. So it'd be rather foolish to be ashamed of its origins. Now, to cut to the quick, there was Isaac Newton, believed in God, probably the greatest natural scientist who's ever lived. Stephen Hawking, of whom you've all heard, no doubt. He's the scientist in the wheelchair. He was just ahead of me at Cambridge, and in his brain power, he's light years ahead of me. And he doesn't believe in God. And he occupied, until recently, the very same chair in Cambridge that Isaac Newton occupied. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Newton discovered the law of gravitation and used it as a reason for believing in God. Stephen Hawking uses it as a reason for denying the existence of God. And that focuses the question beautifully. How do you get from Newton to Hawking? How can one man use the law of gravity as evidence for the existence of God and another uses it as evidence to deny the existence of God? And I want to focus on that because I found it helpful to lead people in to this kind of debate. Now, of course, one of the things that stops people almost dead at the beginning of this discussion is the very vocal nature of some scientists. Carl Sagan, in the beginning of his book, Cosmos, the universe is all it is, was, or ever shall be. And people think, isn't that wonderful science? It isn't science at all. It's a statement by a scientist, but it's not a statement of science. And one of the first things to learn in trying to understand what's going on in our culture is to realize that statements by scientists are not always statements of science. This was just a statement of Carl Sagan's atheism, that's all. A statement of his belief system. So that is the first thing to realize. The second thing, and perhaps we should put alongside that, the comment by Richard Feynman, who was a brilliant Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Caltech. Feynman was very apt to put a pin in people's pride. And he once said, outside of science, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And I think it's very important to realize that, and it's true of me too. So don't leave me out of this. The next thing to realize is that just as not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science, science is not the same as rationality. Science has had such powerful effects in technology in our world that there's grown up a view that we call scientism, and that is that science is the only way to truth. Now that is just logically false, because the statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science, so if it's true, it's false. Perhaps it's too late at night for logic like that, is it? But never mind. It's logically contradictory. And some of the greatest scientists, like Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, says we do science a disservice if we ever suggest that it can answer all questions. It can't. It can't even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What's the meaning of life? And incidentally, here lies another answer to our question, why science hasn't buried God. God and science answer different questions. Charles Townes, brilliant American Nobel Prize winner, Christian, invented the maser, the forerunner of the laser. He said, but look, science deals mainly with the hows. How does this work? How does that work? It doesn't deal with meaning and purpose. Religion, Christianity, deals with meaning and purpose. They don't even deal with the same thing. So how one could eliminate the other is very, very difficult to see. So that brings us a little bit more into it. I'm passionate about science, but it is very dangerous to say it's the only way to truth. The great scientists all know it isn't. Einstein once said, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you can't speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. Science is powerful, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because it asks a limited number of questions. It doesn't deal with every area of existence. Weinberg admits, I think in his most recent book, that it doesn't deal with beauty and love. In fact, it doesn't deal with all the things that are most meaningful to every single one of us. It's limited. It's powerful. It's successful. But it cannot say anything about the big questions in this sense. Of course, another difficulty you'll run into is the God Delusion. I'm sure you've all heard of the book, The God Delusion, by Richard Dawkins, one of the world's best-selling books. And this often stops the conversation when some scientist says God is a delusion. or an illusion, just like Santa Claus. And it's very funny, you know, I get this a lot from people who ought to know better. I was speaking at a forum like this in the Technical University of Delft in Holland. And there was a physics professor who said, your belief in God is just like Santa Claus. So I thought this is going to be interesting. And there were about 2,000 people sitting in the audience. So I put it to them. I said, ladies and gentlemen, let's test this out. He says my belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus. Now I said, put up your hand. Anybody who came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult. And there was utter silence. Not a hand went up. There weren't even any lunatics in the audience. And then I said, put up your hand if you came to believe in God as an adult. And hundreds of hands went up. I said to him, please don't insult our intelligence. Some of the brightest people in the world have spent centuries thinking about God. Our universities were founded by people who thought about God. Oxford and Cambridge still carry Christian mottos. The motto of my university is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my illumination. They believed in God. They outfought their contemporaries. Please don't insult us by putting God into the same category as Santa Claus. But that's exactly what happened. Because they've got such authority. Stephen Hawking, whom I must mention this, but forgive a personal reference, will you? Perhaps you don't want to hear a story, do you? Oh, you do? Oh, well. Well, anyway, Stephen Hawking was asked by one of our leading newspapers, what about religion? Oh, he said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And I think it was the Times asked me to comment, and I said, you want a one-liner? Oh, yes, we want a one-liner. Well, I said, well, if that's true, then atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, you laugh, ladies and gentlemen, but actually you shouldn't, because it doesn't prove anything. This is Freud's argument. And it often stops the entire debate before you get started, and it's very foolish. I want to tell you why. One of the most brilliant psychiatrists in Germany is Manfred Lutz, and he's written a book on this. And he says, if there is no God, the Freudian argument, you all know what that is, that God is a wish fulfillment and so on, and father figure in the sky. If there is no God, that's a great argument to explain religion, if there is no God. But of course, he says, if there is a God, the very same argument explains atheism as the wish never to have to meet God and never to have to give account for the things you've messed up in life and so on. But as to the question whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Frankl, Jung, or any of the others can help you. And that's so important because it cuts straight through that. We need to think more carefully than that. So that's what I want to try to do now. We'll move beyond that and face the question that Stephen Hawking puts. You've got to choose between science and God. Now, I love young people. I've been a passionate teacher all my life. And now adults, young people, students, professors are faced with this. You've got to choose between science and God. If you want to be regarded as an intelligent person in a scientifically literate age, you've got to give up on God. And this is coming from Hawking, who ought to get the Nobel Prize. If they discover Hawking radiation, he probably will. And I was bothered. I couldn't understand. How do you get to that? You've got to choose between science and God. And I used to think, and I still do, as I'll explain in a moment, that the problem was his understanding of science. But then I suddenly realized the bigger problem is his understanding of God. Now, try to follow me carefully. When I was young, about a century ago, it feels that sometimes even more, but there we are. When I was young, if I used the word God in public in Ireland or England, people understood that what I was talking about is the God of the Bible, the eternal creator and sustainer of the universe. But that's no longer the case. So much pressure has been brought to bear to get the God of the Bible relegated to the sort of God you got in Greek, Babylonian, Egyptian, or Assyrian religion, the gods of the pantheon. So that when we talk about God, many people, including Hawking, as I shall demonstrate in a moment, think that that's what we're talking about. Now follow me. as I described to you, such a God. Let's think of the Greek god of lightning. They didn't understand lightning. They were afraid of it. And so this is a god behind it. But you do a bit of atmospheric physics at this university here, and that god disappears. Because it was a god of the gaps. It really amounts to saying, I can't explain it, therefore a god did it. That is what many of our contemporaries, ladies and gentlemen, think is the Christian position. Now, I must talk from within my own understanding of things. And I see here's a massive problem. You see, gods of the gaps disappear with advancing science. In that sense, science has buried many gods, and thank God it's so. Many gods. Because those ancient gods are deifications of the forces of nature. And one of the world experts on the gods of the ancient Near East, in which I'm massively interested because I've just written a book about them that's been mentioned, he said this: there's a vast difference between the gods of all the ancient mythologies and the God of the Bible, in that the gods of all those mythologies were products of the original primeval stuff of the universe. They were actually material gods. They were, I quote, descended from the heavens and the earth. And then he says the God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. You can't put them in the same category. That's the first point. But secondly, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. I'm sure most of you have heard the first sentence from Genesis. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't understand. No, but that's what many people think. That God is put there as a kind of placeholder. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But when I can explain it, we won't need God. That's very simplistic and naive, ladies and gentlemen. The God of the Bible created the whole show, the heavens and the earth, the bits we do understand and the bits we don't. And in fact, it was the bits that Newton did understand that increased his faith in God. Isn't that true of you? The more you understand of painting, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the workings of a turbofan jet, not the less. And so it was with Newton as he found the law of gravity. He didn't say, oh, I've got an explanation, I don't need God. No, he said, what a brilliant God to do it that way. And he wrote the Principia Mathematica and dedicated it at the beginning in the hope that a thinking person would come to believe in God through it. That's the right way round. Now, do you follow me? Now, here's the crucial logic. If you think that God is a God of the gaps, you have to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. In other words, I believe that many of these new atheists, so-called, are telling people to choose between science and God because they got a primitive, thoroughly pagan concept of God. Now, that may surprise some of you, but it helps me explain a lot of what's going on. That's the theological side of it. But of course, there's another side to it. There's a scientific side. You see, why did Newton not abandon God when he found gravity? For a very simple reason. He didn't think that God is the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. Why is the water boiling? Well, it's boiling because the heat energy from the flame is being conducted through the base of the copper kettle, and that's stimulating the molecules of water. They're moving faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. Is it? No, it's boiling because I would like a cup of tea. Now, why are you laughing? Well, you're laughing because I'm talking nonsense. Which of the two reasons is the correct one? Both. And you need both. The scientific explanation and the personal agent explanation. Now tell me, which is the more important one? People have been making tea for millennia without knowing anything about the science of heat. It's actually the personal one. Now, that's a very simple illustration. I find kids can understand it, but a lot of scientists can't. It's utterly astonishing. They say the science is the only explanation you need. That's nonsense. Now, follow this. My two explanations of the water boiling don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. They're two different kinds of explanation, but now comes the crunch. You need both of them. Let me give you another illustration, because this is such an important thing. God no more competes with science in explaining the world than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion in explaining a motor car. And so, I'm afraid many of these new atheists are just talking sheer nonsense because they don't understand the nature of explanation. It's worse than that. When we hear somebody say, science explains, you've heard people say that. And what do we think? For instance, I was taught the law of gravity at school. We might as well stick with that. We're on gravity tonight. Keeps us on the ground, you know. What was I taught about the law of gravity? Do you know what I thought at school? I thought it explained gravity. It doesn't, you know. Nobody knows what gravity is, not even today. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman. You see, the law of gravity is brilliant. It gives us a mathematical way of calculating the motion, say, of the planets and so on. It enables us to land a person on the moon, even without Einstein's corrections. It's wonderful, but it doesn't tell us what gravity is. Newton realized that. Non fingo hypothesi, he wrote. I don't make hypotheses. I don't know what gravity is. But here's a mathematical description of how it works. I think Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, put it best when he said, the great delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature, when they're not. They are descriptions. They're not explanations. So what's that saying? It's saying when we say the law of gravity explains, it doesn't explain everything, even at the scientific level. The nature of explanation is very different from the popular understanding of it. And this is so important. The God explanation doesn't conflict with a scientific explanation, mostly answering completely different questions, as we've seen. So the idea that science can bury God begins to look more and more foolish. Now, there's lots more we could say, but I'm going to say just two more things, and we will then go into a time of questions. One of the biggest confusions is as to the nature of God. That's one. The second one is the nature of scientific explanation. The third one, ladies and gentlemen, is faith. In the introduction, the phrase science and faith were mentioned. I wonder what you thought that meant. Science here, faith there. What is faith in that sentence? Is it a shorthand for religion? Or is it faith in the sense of trust? Now here's where all the confusion comes. Because Dawkins and co. have redefined faith. Now, faith in the English language is used in two ways. One is the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, and so on. It's to stand for a body of teaching. The other is faith in the sense of trust. Have you faith that the Red Sox are going to win, or something like this? You know, that kind of stuff you hear. Have you got faith that so-and-so is going to be the next president of the United States? I wouldn't dare mention any names, of course. Have you got faith in the stock markets, or do you believe, and so on. That is the normal use of the word faith. It means trust, fides, fidelity. And whenever you use it, the next question is, what is the basis of your trust? And if you've no basis, then you're credulous, all right? Now here's the problem. faith has been redefined in the Mark Twain sense. You remember what Mark Twain wrote? Faith is believing what you know ain't true. And the new atheists regard faith as a religious term that means believing where there's no evidence. Both of those are very dangerously incorrect. Faith is not just a religious term, it's an ordinary word, means trust. And secondly, it does not mean believing, certainly not in the Christian sense where there's no evidence. Now, this is so important. I speak as a Christian now. Other traditions must speak for themselves, and rightly so. But Christianity is an evidence-based commitment. You can see that all over the place, but here's a classic case, the Gospel of John, where John is writing towards the end of his book, and he said, many other signs Jesus did, semeion, from which we get semiotics, indicators, pointers. Many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence on which faith can be based. It's evidence-based faith. I wouldn't sit here for a microsecond if I didn't believe that. It's not believing where there's no evidence. But now here's the rub. If you talk about science and faith, you obscure the fact that science is faith-based. You obscure it completely. Now let me explain that to you. Einstein says, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God, of course. He meant faith in the rational or the mathematical intelligibility of the universe. That is, putting it simply, faith that science can be done. I wouldn't do science if I didn't believe it could be done. That's the basic credo, you see. And to talk about science and faith immediately gives the atheist the ground. That's an atheist formulation. It's not a Christian one. So I never talk about that. If people want to say faith in science and faith in God, that's fine, so long as we see that there's faith on both sides. But now here's the problem. Here's the problem. Let me illustrate this. I have fun in Oxford. Well, I have fun in most places because I spend most of my life playing Socrates, asking questions, you see. So sometimes I say to my scientific friends, what do you do science with? Oh, they say, I've got this machine worth $1 billion. I said, no. Oh, you mean my... And they're about to say mind when they remember there's no such thing as the mind, according to them. And they say my brain. Well, I said, okay, that'll do. I mean, I do believe that the mind is distinct from the brain. But there's another story. You do science with your brain, do you? Oh, yes. I said, tell me about the brain. What is the brain? What's its story? What's the brain story? Well, do you want the long version or the short version, please? Well, the story of the brain is simple. I mean, when it boils down to it, the brain is an end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and smile and I say, and you trust it? I said, just a minute. If you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it for a moment. How can you say that your thinking is valid if it's coming from an apparatus that cannot be trusted? Now, this is enormously important. This is not a new argument. C.S. Lewis saw it in the 1940s. He said, science has done wonders because we've been thinking about the universe, but we've forgotten to think about thinking. And when we begin to think about thinking, any theory that renders thinking invalid cannot be true because it was generated by thinking. And if thinking is invalid, then it cannot be true. But if you reduce all thinking processes simply to physics and chemistry of neurons and molecules and atoms, you empty the universe of thinking. Now, the interesting thing now is that an atheist has championed this view. And a lot of things has changed. The leading Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, has been talking about things like this. But more recently, Thomas Nagel of New York, who's a brilliant philosopher. He's an atheist. He's a strong atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God. He's totally honest. But he says, look, there's something seriously wrong with materialism. Because if evolutionary naturalism is true, it undermines any reason for believing in any theory at all, including evolutionary naturalism. Now, that's a very serious objection. And you see, ladies and gentlemen, one of my main reasons for thinking, what was her title? Has Science Buried God? I've got a new title. Has Science Buried Atheism? And I believe that's the case. The very fact that we can think rationally is, to me, a prime evidence that there's something more to this universe than physics and chemistry. In other words, in a very real sense, your first step into realizing that there exists the supernatural is human reason and intelligence. That's big stuff, isn't it? And it's very important stuff. Now, here's the interesting thing. We started off with these two worldviews. For me, the Christian worldview and the atheist worldview. What I'm arguing is this, that putting God into the equation makes perfect sense, because the reason we can do science, of course, from a Christian perspective, is that the same God created the universe out there and the mind in here that's studying it. The atheists remove the grounds from it. And I believe they don't only shoot themselves in the foot, that's quite painful. They shoot themselves in the brain, and that's fatal. So there's a very serious problem here. But let me put it another way. The two worldviews are so different because one begins with mass energy, the particles, or, much more popularly, and you might want to ask me about this, nothing. A universe from nothing, as Lawrence Krauss says. And everything arises from nothing, spontaneously and on its own, including all the physics and chemistry, psychology, consciousness, life, everything else. Or it begins with God. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him. Do you see the difference? In the atheist worldview, it started with nothing or mass energy or something like that. And everything else, including mind, is derivative. In the Christian worldview, it's the exact opposite. Mind is the ultimate reality, the mind of God. And mass energy and physics and chemistry and everything else is derivative. And it's not only as a Christian, but as a scientist, that it's that worldview that makes infinitely more sense to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lennox. If you have questions, if you want to pass them towards the center, Adam and we'll have some others grab those. And as we do, you can take some time and maybe write some others as they come to you, and we'll get them up here. I wanted to start by asking you a question that kind of arose in my mind. You mentioned a little bit of this, that this question, has science buried God, is not a new question. I think you did. You hinted at it. Is it being answered in a different way now, where I think I feel the sense that it's being answered more confidently that science has, and how would you respond to that?
It's hard to say because I sit inside the topic, and I'm certainly a lot more confident in responding to it than I was before. But the reason for that confidence is that I spent my life, virtually all of my life, exposing my views to their opposite. That has been very important for me. I want to know what's true. I don't want to be fooled. And I discovered very early on that if you sit with people who don't hold your worldview and start to find out where they're coming from and so on, and test what you believe against what they believe, that is where the confidence comes from. Secondly, I think there's an increased number of people that take these things seriously and don't dismiss them. And some of the atheist voices are sounding remarkably shrill. And Alistair McGrath wrote a book called The End of Atheism, even, which is going a long way to say perhaps we're seeing a decline. Nevertheless, I feel that what's happening in my culture at home in the United Kingdom is that particularly Richard Dawkins has had a huge impact. And now the kids at school are citing all these arguments and throwing them at us. I only mentioned very few, but they're very willing to listen to a reasoned answer, and their response is often utterly amazing. I was in a leading school just recently, and the young man who played your role and did the introduction, he was an atheist and told us so at the beginning. At the end, he said, I don't know where I am anymore. I've never heard arguments like this. And therefore, I find that it's because one side has got the media in our country. People don't hear the other arguments. I want people to hear both sides, and I believe that people are intelligent enough to make their own decision. Let's not treat them as infants and why don't you hand us a few of those so that we can begin to start and think of them. So that would be my initial response, Jonathan. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to experience a very inadequate phenomenon. It's called a Q&A. And it's inadequate for this reason, that we've got 50 or 60 questions at least. I haven't even had time to skim them. And all I can do, of course, by definition, is give you an initial response virtually off the top of my head, which means that perhaps they deserve an hour of a lecture and maybe 100 or 200 hours of my work to put into it, which I can't do. But that's good, you see. Because if you've asked the question, then it's the work you do afterwards that's going to be really meaningful to you. I can only make initial suggestions. So we're going to have a look at some of these, and he'll read them out randomly, and we'll see how we go. So I hope that's understood.
Okay, we'll get started with one. Why has scientific orthodoxy taken over the university and popular worldviews?
Well, I would suggest it's not scientific orthodoxy, it's scientism. Science is perfectly respectable, but the point is, and I think that's what the question means, that the idea that science is the only way to truth, I call it scientific fundamentalism, because it is characteristic of the most extreme kinds of fundamentalism. Only one answer works and so on. And why has it taken over? Because the positive side is because of the tremendous success of science. And because of the empirical nature of a lot of science, it has assured results, whereas in other fields they're much more vague and uncertain and matters of opinion and so on. But it's overkill. But also it has suited the secular spirit of the age, where there's been, for a very long time now, a constant undermining of any sort of belief in God or credence to God and so on and so forth, for all kinds of historical reasons that one could go into. And I would want to be scientifically orthodox in that sense, but I want to fight against with tooth and nail this idea that science is the only way to truth. I mean, after all, if science was the only way to truth, you'd have to close half the faculties of this university tomorrow. I mean, just think about it. So that's all I'll say about that. They're huge. I mean, Charles Taylor's book on secularism is about 1,000 pages. That gives some good answers to that question.
All right, can you science explain love?
Well, the problem there is explain. And I'll quote Weinberg. It's good to hide behind a Nobel Prize winner. He says no. Now, what science could do, of course, if you want to push a little bit, and I'm assuming he wants to push, if you want to push a little bit, science, of course, could link you up to an electroencephalogram and measure the bits of your brain that light up when you have feelings of love and all this kind of thing. But that's not explaining it. That is giving correlations between the brain story. But the brain story is not the same as the mind story. You can read my brain story by lighting up bits of my brain, but you can't see what's in my mind. That's a huge topic and goes into the mind-body problem and all the rest of it.
Okay, so this one, Stephen Hawking uses the term mind of God. It appears that he is referencing things that have not yet been explained. Why does he use this term if he does not believe in God?
Well, Stephen Hawking shows a certain development in his thinking. And that phrase comes at the very end of the book, the most unread book in history, they say, A Brief History of Time, which everybody has bought and nobody's got beyond page 3. It's a nice turn of phrase, isn't it? The most unread book in history. And he left it open, tantalizingly so. But in his more recent book, The Grand Design, he's closed that down. And he's now very clearly an atheist. And science has proved that God doesn't exist and so on. I didn't say anything about him. And I should perhaps have said, but I think I noticed a question about nothing, and we can come to that.
Come to that in a minute. We have several questions that want you to talk about the Big Bang. So how is God related with science and the Big Bang?
Well, the Big Bang is simply a label and a mystery. I keep coming across Christians that are afraid of it, but there's no need to be afraid of it. Fred Hoyle, who coined the phrase, it was a joke, and he didn't approve of there being a beginning because he believed in a steady state universe. And part of his reasoning was that if you believe in a beginning, it raises a God question instantly. So he said, you and your Big Bang. That was a resistance against the idea there was a beginning. Now, what does the Big Bang mean? It means there was a beginning to the universe. What was it? We haven't a clue scientifically. So it needn't worry you, because the basic assertion is what the Bible's been saying for thousands of years, that there was a beginning. See, here's the irony of this. I remember, because I'm old, the 1960s. I don't remember the 1860s, the 1960s. When the first, well, not the first, but major evidence came in that there was a beginning to space-time. We'd had the Hubble shift of the galaxies. We'd had and it came then, the microwave background, Arno Penzias, who won the Nobel Prize. And when that started coming into serious consideration in Britain, the scientific establishment reacted vehemently against it. And there was an editorial in the most famous scientific periodical in the world, Nature, by John Maddox, who was the editor at the time, saying, we must not give in to this idea of there being a beginning. Why? Because it will give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. The major astronomical and astrophysical result of the 20th century was resisted because it paralleled Scripture. Scripture's been saying it for thousands of years. And I'm cheeky sometimes with the scientists. So one time I was in a very big meeting with some major people, and they said to me, surely you're not serious, Professor Lennox, in suggesting the Bible has anything at all relevant to say about this. Well, I said, you know, the Bible is, of course, not a textbook of science. I've never taught algebra from Leviticus, and I never will. But it makes statements about the same universe as science talks about. And when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it's talking about the same heavens and earth that the astronomers are interested in. Now, I said, if you'd taken the biblical worldview more seriously than you did the Aristotelian worldview, that is, that the universe has existed forever, you might just have looked for evidence for a beginning before you did. Because when that evidence started to come in and you were forced to accept it, you resisted it because it paralleled the Bible. So please don't tell me the Bible had nothing to say. Did that answer the question? I can't remember what the question was.
It did. All right, I've been searching through for some others. How can we as Christians deal with perceived contradictions between scientific observations and biblical teaching? For example, the age of the earth, without subordinating the Bible to science or ignoring science altogether.
How long do you want me to talk for? This is a very controversial topic for many Christians. It's not controversial out there. The world isn't interested in it. But it seems that people are puzzled. And I know many friends in this country particularly who are passionate about science. And then they're taught in church that they must believe a particular interpretation of Genesis that appears to contradict by many orders of magnitude the age of the earth as determined by astronomy and astrophysics. And that creates a lot of pain. Believe you me, it creates a lot of pain. And I admire young people that want to take Scripture very seriously. I do. I believe in the authority and inspiration of Scripture. And that's why my heart goes out to people like that. And ladies and gentlemen, let me just say that on this topic, the saddest thing is to see Christians fighting one another. That brings the gospel into disrepute. And of course, the world outside who isn't interested just think you're crazy. Now that's a very serious business because it puts them off thinking about anything else. Let me put it this way, and this is the very brief answer. If you'd asked me that question 500 years ago, it wouldn't have been that question. What it would have been is, Professor Lennox, what do you think of this upstart Galileo who thinks the earth moves when the Bible says it doesn't? God has set the earth on its pillars and it should not be moved. How many people in this audience believe the earth is fixed relative to the stars and doesn't move? So you don't believe the Bible, any of you? The Bible says it doesn't move. You see, for 1,700 years, there was a controversy about this. It started off with everybody being a fixed earther. You ever met fixed earthers? No. There's no one here. And then there were a couple of moving earthers. And then the group of moving earthers got bigger and bigger and bigger until the fixed earthers have all disappeared. 1,700 years or so for that to happen. What people discovered, ladies and gentlemen, is this: that although you could interpret the Bible in terms of a fixed earth, you didn't have to, without losing its authority. Now we're at a similar problem. You could interpret the Bible as indicating that the earth is young, but do you have to? Well, let me make one suggestion, all right? May I do that? Just one.
Of course.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was that? Well, there's a sequence of days in Genesis 1. You've heard of them, haven't you? In the beginning, that was day one. No, it wasn't. The sequence of days all begin with, and God said, don't they? And God said, let there be light, and so on, day one. And God said in day two. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was not on day one. That's the first thing you notice simply from the text. Secondly, the first two verses of Genesis are written in a different past tense than the sequence of days. And because I wanted to get it right, and I'm not a Hebrew expert, I asked the professor at Cambridge and the professor at Oxford. Both of them believers, incidentally, in God. And they said, well, the tense simply indicates that the first statement occurred at an indefinite time before the sequence. So what does the Bible say about the age of the earth? Nothing whatsoever. Full stop. Isn't it sad that people fight about it? Of course, you could interpret it as indicating that the earth is young, but there's a danger of trying to protect Scripture by overkill, by claiming it says something which it doesn't actually say. And here's the irony of it. No matter what you believe about the days, in the beginning was not in day one. What do I believe about the days? Well, I've written a book about it. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World, but I'm not going to go on any more about that.
Thank you. Okay, can you say something about miracles? Are they scientifically provable, or why don't we see them happening in scientifically advanced?
Long ago, David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, pointed out that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and we know the laws of nature, so that's it. Now that's where many people stop, including the late Christopher Hitchens, with whom I had a long discussion about this, in public actually. You can see it on the web, I believe. David Hume has caused generations of people to believe that the miracles of the Bible, and I'm going to restrict to those because if you start believing that everything that claims to be a miracle is a miracle, you end up in trouble. But think of Scripture, the basic central thing, that God became incarnate, that Jesus rose from the dead. Miracles violate the laws of nature. Hume was wrong. Now that sounds a pretty arrogant kind of statement to make of a brilliant philosopher, but you see, I happen to get to know Hume's world-class, the top interpreter in the world, Antony Flew, a philosopher, who had taught this stuff all his life until high old age, until he came to see that Hume was wrong. And he told me himself, he said, I wish I could rewrite my books because on this it was wrong. And for a very obvious reason. C.S. Lewis saw it. He's the best person to read on this. He's got a book called Miracles, and most people get to about chapter 3. They find chapter 4 hard, they give up. That's a great pity because the rest of it's much easier. So there's a hint for you. But the basic idea is best explained by an analogy. I'm staying in a hotel here. I put $100 in the drawer on Monday night. I put another 100 in on Tuesday night, so we got $200. I wake up on Wednesday and I find $50. Now, what has been broken? The laws of arithmetic or the laws of Texas? Well, what has been broken? The laws of arithmetic or the laws of Texas? What's been broken? The laws of Texas. How do you know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Isn't that so? You know that 100 plus 100 equals 200. You don't say, that was yesterday, they equal 50 today. You'll not get far in banking if that's the way you work. Now, here's a very interesting thing. The mistake was to think that that drawer was a closed system. It turned out not to be. A thief came and put his hand in. Mathematics can't stop that. But it's the mathematics that can't be broken that tells me that a hand has been put into the system and pulled $150 out. It's exactly the same. Jesus rose from the dead. He didn't break the laws of nature. If I were claiming as a Christian that he rose from the dead through some natural mechanisms going on in the tomb 5 minutes before it happened, then it would be breaking the laws of nature. But the biblical claim is that God raised him from the dead by his power. And the central issue then is this world a closed system of cause and effect? The claim is, no, it isn't. God can reach into it, and by his power, it's not breaking any laws of nature. You see, here's the irony. In order to recognize a miracle, you have to know the laws of nature, and there have to be laws. If you didn't know that it was normal for dead people to remain in the grave, you wouldn't be the least bit surprised at a resurrection, would you? You see, Hume also said a very foolish thing. He said, you see, it was very easy to believe in miracles in the time of the New Testament because they didn't know the laws of nature. Well, does he read the same New Testament as I read? When Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant, Joseph hadn't a clue where babies came from, did he not? And so he immediately believed her. No, he was going to divorce her, wasn't he? Why? Because he knew exactly as well as a modern gynecologist what happens. And it was a special visitation from God. The man born blind, wonderful story in John 9. I love it, his cheek really talking to the... And he says, look, from the very beginning of the world, it's never been heard that a man that was born blind gets seeing. In other words, I recognize this as a miracle because I know the norm. Of course they understood the basic laws of nature, and that's why they recognized miracles. And miracles were interventions of God by his power that did not break any laws. So that's my initial answer to that, but this is such an important question that I've written a book about it as well. The last 2 chapters of my book, Gunning for God, do something a bit unusual. They take David Hume's ideas and they look at the resurrection through them. So some of you might just be interested in that.
That's fascinating. Okay, we're gonna close with this question. This will be our last one, and it's, what is the toughest question you face as a Christian?
The hardest question any of us face is not the question of science and God, it's the question of suffering and God. Now, that's not our topic tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but do you want me to say something briefly about it? Do you? I come to North America frequently, and it's the question that comes up most often. We're faced with awful questions in our contemporary world. And the problem is that when you ask it, when it gets into the room, you realize, first of all, that there are two kinds of suffering. There's moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. And there's pain, cancers, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on, that we don't immediately blame other people on. And then there are two perspectives. There's well, let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology than it does to the young woman of 25 with 3 children who's just been told she's 6 months to live. And when this question comes up, there's an intellectual side and there's a pastoral side. And you've got to be aware of both. So very, very briefly, and this is hopelessly inadequate. So what I'm going to say now is this. I have a website, johnlennox.org. But if you Google my name in New Zealand, I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And I had to change every lecture, every TV interview, every radio interview, earthquake, why? And somebody has put them all together and they're still there. And if you want to hear what I say in detail, but very briefly, it's this. I understand people that become atheists because of suffering. I've been to Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. What do you say? But the atheist route has problems. Because if you say, well, that's just how the world is, Richard Dawkins does this. The world's just what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's his view. But half a minute, if there's no good and no evil, why are you talking about the problem of evil and pain? Where do you get the concept of good and evil from if you deny the existence of God? And I want to go down that route because I spent a lot of time in Russia. And for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky was almost a prophet when he pointed out, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave well. Of course they can. I believe that all men and women are made in the image of God as moral beings, and of course they can behave. What he meant was there's no rational justification for morality if there's no God. Just as I believe, and I've explained to you tonight, why I think there's no rational justification for science if there's no God. This is a parallel thing. So the atheist view has huge problems. And of course, what does it solve? The one thing it doesn't solve is the pain or the evil, still there. So what do we do? Well, let me tell you very briefly what I do. We've all asked the question, surely if there's a good God who's all-powerful, there'd be no evil. So he can't be good or he can't be powerful. You've all heard that, haven't you? And you've all spent hours like I did as a student going through the night. Surely a good God would, could, might, should, all this kind of thing. Have any of you ever come to a satisfactory conclusion after that? No. Not one. I've never met one. Do you know why? It's very simple to see why. Because when we finish the discussion, we're faced with beauty and barbed wire in our world. Or beauty and bombs. It's a mixed picture. That's our problem. And any explanations that don't face that just don't wash. They don't work. So how do we cope with beauty and bombs? That's putting it very bluntly. But you know, if we don't face these things, We can't solve the problem of if God was this and this and this and this, then surely he would. The fact is, we got beauty in bombs. I'm a pure mathematician, and one of the few things I've learned from that is, if you can't solve one question, change the question. So here's my question. Granted that it's beauty in bombs, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there's a God that you could trust with it? Now that's a big question, ladies and gentlemen. I believe there is. See, at the heart of Christianity is not only a resurrection, but a cross. Now come with me. You might find this difficult, but I often say to audiences, look, at least listen to what Christianity says before you reject it. Like I listen and spent my life listening to atheists and Hindus and so on and so forth, arguing their case. At least listen. The claim is that the man on the cross was God incarnate. That's a colossal claim. But come with me. If he was, it raises a very deep question. What's God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, and I've often sat beside people who are suffering intensely, and some of you may be right now, and said, at least that tells us that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window, but it opens. Because if that were the end of the story, there'd be nothing more to be said. But the resurrection now tells us that death is not the end. And when the early Christian apostles went out into the world and preached the resurrection, one of the main points they made was, it guarantees there's going to be a final judgment. That's a marvelous thing. Justice will be done. The women and children that screamed their way into eternity in Auschwitz. Does God know about that? Of course he does. Now, this is a huge issue, and I almost hesitate to compress it like this. But ladies and gentlemen, the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ now become a huge focus for something absolutely colossal. Not only does the cross mean that God has drawn near to us in our suffering, it's much deeper than that. If Christianity is true, Christ took upon himself all those things that cause suffering. All the mess that I've made in my life that's caused other people to suffer. And sometimes I thought it was wonderful. My snide remarks, my hate, my jealousy, and all this kind of stuff. He's taken them upon himself so that he can forgive me. Science has nothing to say about love. It's nothing to say about forgiveness. But the biggest thing that I need as a human being is forgiveness. Is there forgiveness? Human guilt is one of the biggest problems in the universe. Now, as I say, this isn't our topic for tonight, but you did ask me to say something about it. And what I would leave you with this. I do not know of any window into this hard question that bypasses the cross. But what I do know is that millions of people have stood at that cross. And by trusting Christ and receiving him into their lives, they've received new life. You know, so often at these meetings in science, people say at the end, and I'm finishing with this, they say, you know, you're a scientist. Aren't you an idiot, really? Because sitting there talking about Christianity, Christianity is not testable. Who told you that? Christianity is testable, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when you watch young people who are dependent on drugs or narcotics, and then you meet them 6 months later and they're free, and you say, what happened to you? Where's the radiance come from? Well, and this is the way they will put it. Well, actually, I found out about Jesus Christ and I trusted him and I've got this new power, and I watched a TV program last Sunday, I think it was, at home. And it was about narcotic dependence and older people, and this house that looked after him run by Christians. And somebody said, what does this house mean to you? And the man said, you see that door into the house? I walked through there and I got saved. Saved in the sense of his life saved and made meaningful. Why? Because they told him about Christ. You see, as you see, I'm pretty old. I'm probably pretty near the end of my life. But I have seen again and again and again and again and again transformation in life. And when you see 2 and 2 make 4 thousands of times, you begin to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. What's it got to do with? It's got to do with Christ. That's the evidence. If that wasn't there, I would quit. But it is there. And I've lived with Christ for over 60 years. And in my family and with my wife, we've put it to the test again and again. Now you say that's all subjective, but in the end, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. If there was no evidence of that kind, there would be absolutely no reason to believe. But I better stop. And that wasn't the topic for tonight. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.